Hello, everybody. This is Deshpande from Embry-Riddle University in Daytona Beach, Florida. I would like to thank the CEDAR committee to give me this opportunity to present my research as science highlight for the career NSF career grant I received last year. So I'll be talking about 2019-20 science highlights through this project on characterization of sources of ionospheric scintillation through modeling, analytics, and machine learning. I would like to thank my co-authors Matt Zettergren, Andres Pitcher, Leslie Lamarche, and my two students from Embry-Riddle, Anna Marie Bals and Chintan Thakrar. So, before I begin talking about the science highlights, I would like to give a brief introduction to what I'm talking about. Um, ionosphere has these ionospheric irregularities. Hopefully, you can see. I'll see my green laser for the virtual presentation. Thought we would have some fun. Anyway, so ionospheric irregularities are produced by different sources, and this cartoon figure lists a few of them. Um, in the Cusp region, you have the shear instability or Kelvin-Helmholtz instability. In polar cap region, you have gradient drift instability, which forms the major part of polar cap patches. In auroral oval, you have majority of auroral precipitation, and of course, I have mentioned these instabilities as sort of major sources, but you have a different combination of these and many other instabilities, such as Farley-Buneman and uh, current convective instability, and so on and so forth, at different regions. So the science question that I'm trying to answer here, or attempting to get some pointer towards, is related to scintillation. By scintillation, I mean radio signal fluctuations. So a radio signal has complex phase and amplitude, and if either of them are fluctuating, that's what I mean by scintillation. So the questions are: what is the relationship between scintillation and sources of irregularities responsible for scintillation, especially at different frequencies? And can we characterize the high latitude irregularities at ENF region also at, for example, auroral oval versus polar cap latitudes in terms of temporal or spectral scintillation signatures using analytics and machine learning? So I would briefly define my approach. I am dividing this presentation into three major categories, results actually, and that's my approach. First is investigating the effects of Kelvin-Helmholtz instability or gradient drift instability in cusp and polar cap region, respectively, on the radio fluctuations. Um, this approach uses physics-based models, which one of them is Gemini, which is the plasma instability model, and the other one is Sigma, which is the forward propagation model. And I'm not presenting in this presentation, but for precipitation, we're right now using spectral models, which still allow us to use an inverse method um, because of the feasibility or computational less complex. Just to give you an idea, Gemini one run takes few days, and for inverse method we need thousands of those runs. Sigma takes another day or two. So basically, we're talking about Gemini Sigma combination, one run of few days, and for inverse, we need several thousand runs. This work has been actually already presented in several conferences We have published this work recently in 2020 JGR publication, and there's one more in preparation for JGR for the GDI work. Spisher et al. Is for KHI, and you can actually get highlights of both of these in detail in the Grand Challenge multi-scale session on Wednesday, 24th of June. The second part is multi-frequency effects on radio signals, where I am mainly focusing on the GDI and polar cap region. I'm looking at signal fluctuations at UHF and VHF, well, UHF GPS frequencies and 400 megahertz and VHF 150 megahertz. And then my students have been working with the machine learning approach to categorize scintillation events from a high latitude data set uh, into categorizing them into locations, basically whether it's a polar cap scintillation or auroral scintillation. And they're presenting some preliminary results, which I'm going to show in a few slides later on. And then finally, what I'm working now on is the spectral slope connection between GDI and KHI and their scintillation signatures on the ground. I'm not showing any slides on this, but this is in works. Okay, briefly, the two physics-based models that I'll be talking about, Gemini and Sigma. Gemini basically generates these ionospheric structures or irregularities for different instabilities, and Sigma is going to basically propagates the signal from a satellite through these irregularities down to ground, whereby we have these scattering, interference, diffraction, reflection effects all included in here. What we get on ground is a similar looking time series to GPS observations. We can look at phase time series and amplitude time series or power variation. So Gemini takes inputs from incoherent scatter radars, any other um, data set that could give us initial electric field, density, velocity, and then it generates a number density fluctuation distribution that is inserted into Sigma, and Sigma generates these phase and amplitude scintillation time series and two-dimensional phase on ground. So the KHI work, which was basically to investigate the effects of Kelvin-Helmholtz instability on radio signal fluctuations. As I mentioned, this is already published, and you can look at this publication for details. But what these scans from in iSCAT radar show that there are sheared flows and enhanced electron temperature regions with occurrence of higher phase scintillation indices that were noted down. Now, this was an event where we expected shear or Kelvin-Helmholtz instability, so we simulated the KHI with the inputs from ESRs, the iSCAT radar, and we actually did simulations for different inertial capacitances to find out what difference it makes on scintillations. So just to give you an idea, the 10 farad inertial capacitance run produced scintillations that you see on the bottom panel, but there are more active scintillations, phase scintillations in the later part of the simulation. So each of these simulations were few minutes at least, and we see a lot more happening in the later part of simulation. whereas a higher capacitance, higher inertial capacitance, um, Kelvin Helmholtz simulation showed us that it was more active in the earlier stages in terms of scintillation on ground. Okay, that was for KHI. In terms of GDI, we have um, this is an example of GDI simulation as it develops over riser. We have included a riser input to initiate this run in Gemini, and we're trying to see what happens in on ground. So the left one is the phase time series, the right one is the power time series, and you see a lot more activity when there are small scale Fresnel scale structures um, and above in these um, GDI edges basically. Now, I also mentioned we're looking at multi-frequency effects on radio signals. This is just an example of what we're talking about. So, the initial GDI, gradient drift instability, this is just a snapshot of gradient drift instability in XY plane, the horizontal plane. And what we tried was we tried to simulate or propagate the signal at different frequencies and saw what we see on ground. So sigma actually can give us snapshots of phase and power, two-dimensional phase and power on ground, and you can see that as we go up in the frequency, you have lower and lower scintillations, or in other words, as we go lower in frequencies, the scintillations, these are basically amplitude scintillations, they become much stronger and adverse, which is expected at these frequencies. But the neat thing, and we're trying to actually understand this with respect to multi-scale analysis, um, which you can hear in Leslie's talk on Wednesday, that how are these scale sizes related to each other, and is there any kind of cascading involved? Okay, the machine learning approach, which is to categorize scintillation, uh, this work is mainly done by my students. Um, so I think I have like a couple of minutes left for this presentation, so I'm gonna try to go through this as quickly as possible without leaving any details. So let's see. So what they did was they looked at one data set which had southern and northern four stations. So they grouped into the northern stations and southern stations, and they were basically trying to categorize between these two whether we can find out from a machine learning clustering approach whether the scintillation comes from a polar cap station or auroral station. So they used a decision tree hierarchical clustering approach, which worked extremely well for the northern hemisphere, where Tromso was actually very much in the auroral oval from different instruments, the MSV, for example, and this was derived and presented in this paper. In the southern hemisphere, South Pole and McMurdo couldn't really have a really good or show any better clustering results, because we think that South Pole was on the brink of being on in polar cap, not really in the rural oval. They actually looked at some linkage distributions, and again for the northern hemisphere, the linkage, which basically is some sort of a correlation parameter, shows that Tromso was definitely showing a clear and really um, distinguished linkage parameter compared to NYA, which is again in the northern hemisphere, compared to the mixed distributions in the southern hemisphere. They also noticed some different shapes of the scatter plots or the distributions, and they're looking at why is there such a difference, and does that have to play anything in terms of the linkage parameters being so clearly well defined in terms of auroral stations versus the polar cap stations. I would also like to mention an outreach activity through this project. Two of my undergrad students actually planned and went to Chile to do an experiment on solar eclipse, where they took one of our GPS receivers, collected data, looked at the TEC and high rate scintillation data. They presented their work at AGU last year, and their poster won an OSPA award. All right, in summary, um, I am trying here for this first year to answer um, this question on how are the irregularity sources related to scintillation. In order to simplify, I'm looking at Kelvin Helmholtz in Cusp and gradient drift in the polar cap region, and we're doing modeling using modeling approach and multi-frequency analysis approach to understand what happens to the radio fluctuations at different stages of KHI, GDI, and at what happens at when we propagate the signal at different frequencies. We're also exploring different machine learning approaches to categorize scintillation events from high latitude data sets. And we are also trying to understand the spectral slope connection between GDI and KHI and their signatures, scintillation signatures on the ground. Now, we are planning to expand this approach to include a variety of signal simulations and observations over a number of high latitude stations. So, for example, my students are looking at the Canadian chain data, and hopefully this approach will lead us closer to our next science questions, which are what is the relative importance of these major sources at high latitudes? Given a scintillation observation, can we predict its sources, and how will it degrade VHF UHF communications? Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions or comments, please send me those at this email address.